Hello, my name is Justin Marwad, and I am an alumnus of the Coolidge Debate Program and a member of the 1890 Society. Currently, I attend graduate school at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. We will now move into session 3. The title of this session is 2008 to the Present, the Collapse of the Hamiltonian Norm. The moderator of this session is Steve Forbes, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief of Forbes Media, a trustee of the Coolidge Foundation, and the executive producer of a new, highly acclaimed documentary, Coolidge, Rediscovering an American President. Please welcome Mr. Forbes and our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this on? Yes, good. Well, thank you very much, Justin. I start to applauding. You know, now in politics, when you're on stage, you applaud yourself now. You can see that it's the new prop, and of course in Europe you're allowed to toast yourself. So wherever that leads. But anyway, we're here this afternoon to discuss why in the world did the Hamiltonian norm finally blow up after 2008. Before then, the Hamiltonian norm, as you heard this morning, survived numerous crises. It's amazing the consistency in America on that. The Civil War settled once and for all, Jefferson versus Hamilton. The Hamiltonian view of the economy triumphed then, and despite some challenges, since then, the norm sort of held up more or less. After the Civil War, the debt was dealt with. The income tax enacted during the war was repealed. Those greenbacks were mentioned this morning, 400 million of greenbacks. In fact, there was a political party that rose up after the war called the Greenback Party that wanted this inflation to continue. Those greenbacks were retired. And in terms of the income tax was repealed, and the spending was sharply reduced, and the U.S. went firmly back under Ulysses Grant, the gold standard. There are challenges in the 1880s, 1890s to have silver in effect replace gold, have some 50% inflation to bail out the agricultural sector. That was decisively defeated in 1896, and by the way, was actually revised and tried again in the 1970s when Bryan-eyed inflation hit the U.S. Agriculture for a while did very, very well, and then went through a devastating depression when the inflation had to end in the 1980s, turned Iowa from a red state to a blue. Now we're getting it back again, finally, decades later. But that survived 1896. In World War I, you had, as you heard this morning, massive increase in debt. And the amazing thing after the war was the debt was reduced by 36%, was the number used this morning. Taxes were cut. Excise taxes were cut, and the U.S. boomed. You might say that 1929 morally was the high point of the Hamiltonian norm. Despite changes with the creation of the Federal Reserve, despite the rise of progressivism, Hamilton reigned supreme until the Great Depression. Even though Hamiltonian norm sort of survived the Great Depression, its high moral ground was challenged. The idea that, hey, maybe we can do things different ways, through printing money, through regulation, through government control of the economy, and things like that, it was starting to be chipped away. Nonetheless, amazingly, after the terrible depression of the 1930s, a gold standard was reintroduced after World War II. Spending, amazingly, was cut sharply, not just defensive spending, but domestic spending was held in line. And there was a big tax cut, thanks to allowing both husband and wife file jointly. Big tax cut. All the wartime controls were removed immediately, which caused short-term dislocations, but unemployment never went above 5%, even though you had over 10 million veterans returning to the workforce. So the Hamiltonian norm sort of survived. But what happened after World War II and with the Great Depression was that after a crisis, the spending went down. And you could see by the late 30s, early 40s, before the war, that the New Deal had been a spent force, was no longer dominating in terms of politically. But then after the war came the Cold War and the rise of enormous influence of the government. Defense spending became the big thing. And in the 1950s, even the highway construction bill, creating the interstate highway system, was justified as a defense measure. It's in the title of the legislation, amazingly. So we got another chance, after the 1980s, the end of the Cold War, to go back to the Hamiltonian norm firmly. Spending was cut, but it was all defense spending. And despite Republicans taking over Congress in 1994 and making attempts to reduce domestic spending, we never had the kind of systemic changes that we had in the 20s, like we did with the Budget Bureau, and we saw what has happened since then. But after 2000, and one of the things that happened that I think also undermined the norm was, David Malpass alluded to it, was going off a gold standard in 1971, which removed the idea of constraint that you should keep integrity of the dollar. A sound dollar went out the window. So the Hamiltonian norm has been under assault. The only reason that Alexander Hamilton is still on the $10 bill, amazingly, was a musical. The popularity of that musical and the cast is what saved Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. They're ready to toss him off. So in terms of today, you've heard the numbers, the huge increase in debt, and I think the distinction now between debt held by the public and debt held by the government for these trust agencies is now garbage. The fact of the matter is, those trust funds have phony, or there are real IOUs from the Treasury Department, but those trust funds have no real assets. When they need the money, where do they go? They have to go to the Treasury Department. Treasury doesn't have a lot of cash, spare cash lying around, has to get the money from revenues or borrowing or printing of the money. So when those come due, as the trust funds are run down, that's going to put another strain on the public purse in terms of raising the actual cash. So the trust funds are bust now in the real sense. And by the way, one of the reforms I hope they ever do someday, probably too late now, is have real government bonds in those trust funds. So if you get a government shutdown, they can just sell the bonds and pay the benefits for Medicare and for Social Security. So with that, we know the disasters that are coming. So now we're going to discuss why this actually happened, why the intellectual prop works that sort of kept the Hamiltonian norm going even after the Depression, even after all of these crises and assaults. What happened after 2008 that sent the thing spiraling into a situation we're meeting and discussing today. So one of the things that we have to remember is the wonderful things that Mellon and Hamilton did and that is managing the debt and making sure the budget was reasonable. And one of the crazy things we didn't do, or good things we didn't do during COVID, was why in the world did we issue so much short-term debt instead of elongating the debt with which you could have done for 2%, 2.5% interest rates for 50 or 100 years. So we went short, which not a smart thing to have done, really dumb. But with that, let's get to our distinguished panel. Our first panelist is Eugene Scalia, who served as labor secretary. The nice thing about his stint as labor secretary, among others, is he was not a pawn of the unions. He thought workers should have freedom instead of being coerced. And that didn't seem radical at the time, but in retrospect, wow, that's something. And so with that, what Gene's going to touch on is he lived through the spending crisis. So he's going to enlighten us on managing spending in a crisis, which this time led to big changes, started with the 2008 crisis, where we had the so-called quantitative easing, and the Federal Reserve, as David alluded to, amassed huge amounts of power. The institution of the Fed became not just a manager of the currency, but a huge power, 8 or 9 trillion. Those are resources taken out of the economy, and they became, in effect, an allocator of capital. No one passed that in legislation. But Gene's going to why don't you give us an upfront view of how do you live through a crisis and why this turned out to be different from crises of the past where we try to get back to some sort of normalcy, as Coolidge and Harding would have said.
Steve, thanks. Good to be here. Full disclosure, I'm not a finance guy. I'm a lawyer.
That's good. The lawyer part, no, but
I didn't know there was a Hamiltonian norm, and I didn't know it had collapsed. So I'm learning stuff here today, like the rest of you. Worst of all, I did not know I had a part in it. But I've been summoned here to address my involvement in one of the biggest misappropriations of taxpayer dollars in American history.
This will reduce your sentence.
I'm speaking of the COVID pandemic unemployment insurance programs. My lawyer advised me that I was not obligated to appear here, but I am here out of respect for the truth and the Coolidge Foundation. As a country, we never experienced anything like the wave of unemployment that began in March 2020. We'd been in the midst of one of the best job markets in decades. In February, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. All this collapsed within days as the economy shut down. In April, the unemployment rate was 14.7%. 16 million people went into unemployment during April. Before COVID, the most claims that had been filed for unemployment insurance in a week was 700,000. That was the high, 700,000 in 1 week. In 2020, we had nearly 7 million unemployment insurance claims 2 weeks in a row, 7 million each week. With millions of Americans not just out of work, but in many cases prevented from working by government measures, a vigorous government response was needed. That response included a federal unemployment payment. Unemployment ordinarily is paid by the states, drawn from reserves that are funded by taxes the states impose on employers. The amount of state unemployment insurance payments, I don't like acronyms, but I'm going to call them UI payments. They vary. In 2020, in Mississippi, the maximum payment was $235. In Massachusetts, in 2020, the maximum was about $1,200. The CARES Act was the principal federal legislative response to COVID. President Trump signed that into law in March 2020. Among the provisions of the act was a supplemental federal unemployment payment of $600 a week. This was paid on top of the state unemployment benefits. Within weeks of the CARES Act being signed, it was clear there were two serious problems with the COVID UI programs. First, the benefit amount was too high. The ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Ron Wyden, had insisted on $600. $600 a week, if you do the math, is equivalent to $15 an hour for a regular 40-hour work week. And some of you may remember that at that time, $15 an hour was the minimum wage amount that progressives were advocating. I've long thought that that $15 an hour minimum wage was how Senator Wyden arrived at $600 a week for the unemployment payment. As I've said, a special federal payment to unemployed workers made sense. It was the right thing to do. But $600 was too high. After CARES started being implemented, research showed that more than 75% of UI recipients were getting more on unemployment than they'd been paid while working. Partly, this was because it turned out that the jobs that were most affected by the pandemic, the people put out of work, were often in lower paying jobs like restaurants, hotels. In Oklahoma, the median wage replacement rate for people on unemployment was estimated to be 165%. That is to say, 1.6 times what people were getting while working. By definition, such a benefit is excessive. It also slackened workers' incentive to return to work once that was possible. By the way, Bill Beach was the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the time. He and I spent a lot of time poring over these numbers during these months. The second serious problem with the UI payment was fraud. It's been estimated that between $200 and $400 billion in federal UI payments were fraudulent. An enormous amount of federal money had been made available, and criminal gangs were formed to collect it. We all heard stories of payments going to prisoners, to foreign gangs, and to people who had never applied for unemployment. Under the CARES Act, this federal UI payment was set to expire at the end of July 2020. But the pandemic and accompanying restrictions lasted longer than anticipated, so there was consensus to continue some sort of federal plus-up past July. My analysis indicated that it was hard to justify a federal plus-up of more than about $200. After that point, too many recipients were getting more from unemployment than from working. But it was an election year, and it was hard to find anyone, Republican or Democrat, willing to reduce the $600 that much. As it happened, no agreement was reached that summer on new COVID legislation. That did not happen until after the election, when unemployment was much lower and a $300 benefit was then put in place. In the interim, after the CARES payment expired, President Trump used FEMA money to fund a $300 weekly payment. As I said, the COVID UI programs were needed and well-intended, but they wasted many, many billions of taxpayer dollars. There were a number of causes. These causes are lessons for the future, so let me wrap up by summarizing a few. First, haste. The CARES Act was written and passed very quickly. It needed to be. I consider the bill a bipartisan achievement, and certainly it came at a crucial time. Still, the speed with which we had to act prevented the analysis and the deliberation that might have produced a more appropriate payment, accompanied by more protections against fraud. Second, a disconnect between who funded the payments and who dispersed them. These were federal funds, some would say taxpayer funds. These were federal funds dispersed by the states. It wasn't the states' money, and they were under great pressure from residents and politicians to pay out fast. At the Labor Department, we wrestled with some states that wanted to shovel out payments, no questions asked. Third, and let me emphasize this to you young people, was the irresistible pleasure of handing out money. The biggest surprise for me as labor secretary, people say to me, what did you learn? What was the surprise? I'd worked at the department before, but I'd not been involved in grant programs. The biggest surprise for me as labor secretary was how much I enjoyed giving out money. To be clear, I am for limited government and fiscal responsibility. But when you meet with grant recipients to give them money to fund a worthy cause, you feel good. They treat you well. You come away thinking, I want to do that again. Money often is a politician's principal way to demonstrate her commitment to an issue. That's a problem. Fourth, election year politics. I've touched on this. The impending election compounded the problems I've described. And fifth, underinvestment. This may get me in trouble with some of you, but pandemic UI payments were being processed by state computer systems that were archaic. When CARES was being negotiated, I went to Capitol Hill with the Treasury Secretary to warn that the UI payments system, that the system we had for unemployment, could not be relied on to disperse the COVID relief. Secretary Mnuchin thought the IRS could make the payments to workers instead. Governor Burgum of North Dakota, you may have heard that name, he had made his money in tech before entering politics. He told me his state's unemployment computer systems were so out of date that he had imported workers from Latvia to find someone who is still familiar with the computer code that system ran on. These old system imposed many limitations on what we were able to do. It's just one example. A state doesn't dispense just one payment amount to everybody. Different workers get different amounts depending in substantial part on what their income was while working. But those state computers couldn't be programmed to scale the federal amount, so we ended up with a single federal amount that, as I said, overpaid the vast majority of recipients. And so, I'll end on this point. Seeing up close how much money the government wastes was the biggest eye-opener for me in my tenure as labor secretary. I'm glad to participate in this conference about the problem. We should remember, though, that waste sometimes arises from not spending wisely in advance. Thank you.
You just touched on the problem. Spending is fun. So our next panelist is John Childs, great entrepreneur, chairman of J.W. Childs Associates. He's managed assets through Prudential Insurance, a wee company out there, and he's going to discuss missed opportunities in recent years to manage better our debt obligations and, how we get how this shift happened from the Hamiltonian norm. You may not know it existed, but when it's not there, you see the consequences. So, John, take it from here.
Well, thank you, Steve. Looking around at the distinguished panelists you've had, secretaries of this and that, professors of this and that, I wondered, why in God's name am I up here? And I figured it out. I've spent most of my career, J.W. Childs Associates, in private equity. Equity is a little bit of a misnomer because basically private equity involves finding a company to buy and then going to your friendly bank or insurance company and borrowing a lot of money to buy it. And so there you are with your little sliver of equity and a pile of debt and a business that presumably is, making revenue and income. And if you're going to succeed in that, you better grow that revenue and pay down the debt. Otherwise, you're going to sell the company back to the bank, which is not the desired outcome. Just as an aside, I don't know if you all noticed, but Amity very wisely left us a $1 million Bolivar note. Is this my payment for the afternoon, Amity?
Tax-free.
Let us. Then in this case, there's a good chance you'll get your money's worth. So, but anyway, this does represent something interesting. There is another way to solve the debt issue, and I don't know that we've kind of alluded to it, but you can inflate your way out of the debt. When the dollar is practically worthless, who cares if there's 34 trillion of them you owe to somebody? So that is a way that has been employed by other people, and it may be that the U.S. is on that track. Anyway, I wanted to make a couple of comments, and while this is very unlikely to happen, I thought, if I were Secretary of the Treasury, what would I do in this condition? And the first thing is what I wouldn't do. And I looked at the job of Steve Mnuchin, who you may recall was Secretary of the Treasury under Trump. One of his jobs, of course, is managing the outstanding debt, rolling it over and paying the interest, et cetera, and presumably trying to minimize that interest on the debt. Steve was handed one of the greatest gifts I think a Secretary of the Treasury has ever received, and Steve Forbes alluded to it. The interest rates during COVID were minuscule, particularly at the long end of the curve. And, Steve talked about issuing 50 to 100-year bonds, which would have been a great idea. But if you just issued 30-year bonds, and if your timing was good, you could have issued them at 1% or a little over. If your timing was off, I think the average was around 1.5 during the 2021 period. Anyway, I'm going to give you some simple math, simple because if it's complicated, I can't do it. But today, prevailing rates at the long end of the curve were over 4%. Then they were 1%. So the difference is 3%. Now, when Mnuchin became Secretary of the Treasury, we didn't have 34 trillion of debt outstanding. Other people have worked on that. But we had a little over 20 trillion outstanding. So if our Secretary of the Treasury had been doing what I would consider his job, he would have extended the rates on the national debt at the time, and we would have saved 3% or 300 basis points on something like, to make the math simple, $20 trillion. Well, by my simple-minded math, that's $600 billion a year. Guess what? It's not in perpetuity, but it is for the next 30 years. And that'll take care of my problems and a lot of people here on the stage. So anyway, so I would expect one thing a Secretary of the Treasury should do is manage the debt according to the opportunities provided by the yield curve. There aren't many today. I had lunch today with a senator who was telling me that Janet Yellen is systematically shortening the yield curve, moving everything into 6 months or less. I think this has the potential for real disaster because you have no flexibility when rates go up. You're going to get stuck. I'm old enough to remember when people paid over 10% a year for the 10-year Treasury. If you ever got back to that level, your 34 trillion, soon to be 35, 36, 37, would be costing you 3.4 trillion a year in interest. That just about eats the total revenue of the United States government. That is a serious issue, and I'm sure someone said it. it's not so much just the amount of debt outstanding, it's the interest rate that you're paying on it that really, makes the difference. Anyway, so Secretary of the Treasury, look at that yield curve and minimize your payments accordingly. Let me make one other point that I think the Secretary of the Treasury could be helpful on. He really should be a leader in tax policy. After all, he oversees the IRS. He's responsible for tax collections. He shouldn't just sit there and, wear his Scrooge hat. He should think about, he should think creatively about what could you do with the tax system. And, our tax system is an utter disaster. Is Seth in the room? Anyway, I wrote an article about taxes, which Amity's husband, Seth Lipsky, very nicely decided to publish, and I will quote myself on the first sentence. It says, "The age-old question of whether a million monkeys typing for a million years could recreate a work of Shakespeare remains unanswered. But they have composed the U.S. tax code." Anyway, I mean, this is unfair to monkeys, but let me just give you an example of the ridiculousness of this tax code we live with. A little over 10 years ago, I asked is Art Laffer with us today? No. Anyway, I asked Art Laffer to take his economic gurus and study the cost of compliance with the U.S. tax code. And I said, Art, don't tell me about how he distorts investment or any of that stuff. Just tell me what I pay H&R Block and my lawyers, and include corporations and individuals. As I say, this was over 10 years ago. And it cost almost $500 billion a year. You can imagine that's higher now. There have been more changes in the tax code. But what a ridiculous way to spend money. I mean, that is just total waste. So I would say a new creative Secretary of the Treasury should think long and hard about how you make your tax code more efficient. And the template through which this should be measured is, how would you maximize growth? I mean, one of the ways you'll ultimately be able possibly to deal with debt is not to grow your way out of it. That may not be possible, but certainly growth will help. So for goodness sakes, focus on growth. And it's interesting, there have been two suggestions, both of which are pretty good. Steve was an advocate of the flat tax, which would take a lot of complexity out of the code. My question is, would it take a lot of pages out of those 80,000 pages? Because part of the problem is not so much multiplying your adjusted gross income by different fractions, but by figuring out, how do I get to my adjusted gross income? What's expense? How do I deal with it? The flat tax would obviously simplify things, bring that $450 billion tab down somewhat. If it happens, short your H&R Block stock. But the other idea was called the fair tax, which is basically a consumption tax or a retail tax. And the beauty of it is you turn the tax collections over to Amazon and Walmart, two of the most efficient companies in the world, and two wonderful things happen. One, poof, you don't have to pay $480 billion or whatever the amount is today. And two, guess what? It's very hard to cheat. Every time you go into Walmart, whether you're a drug dealer or a bookie or who knows what, you get to pay your taxes. I mean, Biden would love it. Everybody be paying their fair share. Anyway, but whether those are the answer or not, what I'm saying is we should get a Secretary of the Treasury in the future who, A, minimizes the cost of the debt by looking at the yield curve carefully and taking advantage of what it has to offer, and B, looking at creatively at the way taxes are collected, and hopefully through the template of how can I change this to maximize economic growth. I rest my case.
Thank you. By the way, the Treasury Department has no imagination. I remember in the early 80s when they're issuing 20-year bonds with a coupon of 15.75% the Treasury Department resisted calls to put call provisions in bonds. Any corporate bond or municipal bond, after 5, 10, or 15 years, they can buy those bonds back at a premium, but retire them early. And so instead, we're stuck with these 15% bonds, cost us unnecessarily tens of billions of dollars. You also touched, John, on something very important that David Malpass touched on, and that is the combination of what Treasury is doing and what the Fed is doing is gobbling up short-term capital that is being deprived of small businesses to finance their inventories and buy equipment. It's a corporatist thing of the worst kind. And as for the flat tax, I think it's a splendid idea. I'll be glad to debate the fair tax at another time. But anyway, anything would be better than the monstrosity we have now. Now we have somebody who has worked for the swamp for a number of years before seeing the light, and that is Jeb Hensarling. He served in the House for 8 terms, from 2003 to 2019, and he chaired the House Financial Services Committee and was co-chair of the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. And served on the Congressional Oversight Panel for TARP. Those of you younger, look up TARP. It's not something you cover something with. It was a program enacted to bail out the capital of banks, and should never have been done the way it was done, but it was done. And so with that, welcome former representative, reformed representative, Jeb Hensarling, who's going to discuss with us his insights on what happened to the Hamiltonian norm and how difficult it was, David Malpass alluded to this, to make changes and how we might do something about it. So, former Congressman, take it away.
Thank you, Steve, very much for that introduction. I might gently push back, though. I didn't work for the swamp. I worked in the swamp. Thank you for the introduction. I want to thank Bill and Amity and the foundation. I'm really, really honored to be a part of what is probably one of the most impressive conferences ever convened on probably what is the single most depressing topic in America. And I'm happy to be a part of it. It reminds me, coming from Texas, an old country western song, I don't know whether to shoot myself or go bowling. Literally right before I got on stage.
Listen to Joe Biden making a speech in the Senate.
I Googled who wrote, "Should I shoot myself or go bowling?" And up pops about 18 different suicide crisis prevention websites. So if the NSA or the FBI is watching, I don't need an intervention. I'm thoroughly on the side of going bowling. Okay, getting most of the frivolity out of my system. So 2008 forward, I was either on the playing field or I was on the sideline looking very closely and listening to a number of play calls. So I'll bring to you that particular perspective on our topic of the national debt. In my own estimation, 2008 is the pivotal year of this time period for many, many reasons. One, the great financial crisis. The ripples of that one event we still see today and represented so very strongly within the national debt figures that we see. First, to state the obvious, we had almost $1 trillion of so-called stimulus under the Obama administration, ostensibly to deal with the crisis. By the way, if you serve in Congress every single day, there's a crisis du jour. You walk onto the House floor, okay, what's today's crisis? Okay. This particular time, we actually believed it. So number one, you simply had $1 trillion, poof, right to the bottom line. But a far greater import is the actions that the Federal Reserve took in exercising what are known as their 13(3) exigent powers. Now, these were powers granted to the Federal Reserve at the tail end of the Great Depression that would allow them to intervene and to offer credit facilities to individual financial institutions under exigent circumstances, okay? Towards the end of the Great Depression, those powers were exercised, and if I remember the numbers, the total line of credit was approximately $15 million. The largest single loan was $300,000. How terribly, terribly quaint. Fast forward to 2008, the 13.3 exigent powers had never been exercised until then. So 2008 comes, and norms are completely upended. And so now you have the Federal Reserve not only loaning to non-bank financial institutions that previously were only accessible through the discount window, they were propping up non-financial institutions and ultimately individual sectors of the economy. They were engaging in credit allocation and propping up one particular sector, in this case, the housing sector. I'm a firm believer that once genies are out of their bottle, they are very, very difficult to put them back in their bottle. And so the precedent that was set in '08 will come back with a vengeance, as Gene was talking about, during the COVID crisis. What we also saw come out of the great financial crisis was ZIRP. As you know, in Washington, a wash of acronyms. We all feel so important because we know the acronyms. You don't know the acronyms? Zero interest rate policy. The Fed became essentially the financier and facilitator of our profligate spending with artificially low interest rates, which they have kept up, as you know, for an extended period of time. The great financial crisis also gave birth to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I would argue spawned two different sub-political groups, both the Tea Party on one end and the progressives on the other. And so today it is the progressives who are embracing the concept of modern monetary theory, i.e. print money as long as you do it in your own currency. The Tea Party for a brief period gave the adrenaline necessary to get as close as we could to what is known in Washington as the grand bargain between Republicans and Democrats. We didn't get there, but they provided that energy. I would say, regrettably, the Tea Party has morphed into the MAGA movement. Whether you love MAGA, hate MAGA, you're neutral. It is not a movement today that cares about the national debt. Also, the financial crisis of '08 gave birth to this very infamous phrase from then, I guess, Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel to President Obama: never let a serious crisis go to waste. It allows you to do things you otherwise could not do. So it allowed for the birth of both Obamacare and how that further exacerbated the problem of social welfare entitlements, which Senator Graham spoke about earlier, and Dodd-Frank, which helped choke off, in many respects, the economic growth engine that could have also helped ameliorate the damage done by all of this particular stimulus spending. So the last good note, I would say, about this year of 2008, 2008 represented the first roadmap for America's future, penned by future Speaker Paul Ryan, which really gave kind of it was the intellectual foundation of the modern entitlement reform movement. Republicans did consider that to be the third rail. I worked with Paul Ryan on a number of different items. I didn't work with him on this budget. I remember him coming to me, describing it to me, of what he wanted to do with Medicare and Social Security. And he asked me to co-sponsor. And being the profile and courage I was, I said, let me sleep on it. So I slept on it. And the next morning, I went to Paul and I said, Paul, if you're going to commit political suicide, I cannot let you do it by yourself. So I'm not proud to say, or I'm embarrassed to say I wasn't his first co-sponsor, but I'm proud to say I think I was his third or fourth co-sponsor for that plan. And what is important about that plan, as I attempt to keep my eye on the clock here, is that for a period, the idea of fundamental entitlement reform was at least normalized within one political party. it no longer was the third rail of politics, be it premium support, set-aside accounts in Social Security. And in fact, in 2011, there was a special election in Nevada. Mark Amadei, it was his election. And you had all the usual spots about Mark Amadei is going to help Paul Ryan push his grandmother over the cliff. I talked to Grandma. It was the most exciting day she had ever had. Well, it turns out that no matter how many millions of dollars that were spent, the polling showed that it was a 50-50 issue. And so Republicans learned that they could indeed back entitlement reform and survive politically, because self-survival is a very, very strong instinct among the elected officials. And so because of that, 2008 are very, very important years. Just quickly, I am getting a bad case of PTSD thinking about Simpson Bowles and the Less Than Super Committee. I'm a veteran of them both, unfortunately both losing efforts. In 2010, Simpson Bowles was convened. It was an executive order. It was not a statutory provision, executive order by President Obama. So it was one of these bipartisan commissions. I would say from the conservative standpoint, its failing was, although it came up with a fairly large number of over $4 trillion in savings over 10 years, less than 7% of that came from healthcare. It came right on the heels of Obamacare. They weren't willing to deal with Obamacare. If you study the issue, you cannot solve the problem without fundamentally dealing with Obamacare. Fast forward to the Less Than Super Committee, which I co-chaired, along with Senator Patty Murray, who, when the Democrats announced she was the co-chair, I couldn't pick her out of a lineup, she couldn't pick me out of a lineup. I remember the first time we convened a meeting, Senator John Kerry, then Senator John Kerry, was a member. And we came in and we started introducing ourselves, and he looked at me and said, "I don't believe I know you." To which I almost wanted to say, well, I don't think I know you. But anyway, I didn't. Be the nice Texan I was. Howdy, I'm Jeb Hensarling from Texas. And so my opening gambit was, as co-chairman and the leader of the Republicans, I said to all the Democrats, okay, we want Paul Ryan's premium support program. What size tax increase do you need to give it to us? I was willing to fill in the blank. And Senator Kerry told me, we can't do that. He spoke over Senator Murray, by the way. We can't do that, but before this is over, we will offer you fundamental entitlement reform. Never happened. Never happened. So we ended up with a sequester. And so there were some savings. It was the heyday of public opinion to be able to move the needle on the issue. I must admit, as I look at all the different efforts after the so-called Budget Control Act, after the Super Committee, you're still fundamentally dealing with discretionary spending. And once discretionary spending is dealt with, you still have Congress deciding to renege because they can't live with those caps, which is why there had to be a Murray-Ryan deal that provided relief from the caps. Basically, give me 2 years of relief and I'll pay you back over the next 10 years. Does anybody remember the cartoon Popeye? If you'll kindly loan me 25 cents for a hamburger today, I'll gladly repay you next Tuesday. Somehow the repayment never quite happens. I'll just end on this note, and that is a couple of numbers. Well, one's not a number, it's a characterization, I guess. And one's bad, one's good. I think any honest reading of history will show that there are only a few republics that will exist beyond 250 years. And most meet their demise through some kind of fiscal crisis, usually arising from the debasement of their currency. Phil Gramm said, looking backwards, that Social Security and Medicare have not been significant contributors to the national debt. I never disagree with Phil Gramm because quite literally he was my professor of economics at Texas A&M University. But the second number, on a go-forward basis, 99% of the unfunded obligations of the federal government are Medicare and Social Security. If you have programs going at 6 and 7% per annum, and good GDP may be 2.5%, as Jeff Foxworthy would ask, are you smarter than a fifth grader? The math does not work. But the solution demographically lies in this room. If grandparents can be convinced that we are grandfathering the grandparents on any entitlement reforms, and if the youth, if millennials and Gen Zers will show the angst that they do over such topics as climate change and abortion, for the greatest intergenerational theft in the history of our nation, where they are being robbed blind to support people my age, if they will show that righteous indignation, then public opinion, which Mark Twain once said is everything in America, some believe it to be the voice of God. Members of Congress believe public opinion is the voice of God. Let your voice be heard.
Talking about Grandma and the wheelchair, somebody observed that that's why wheelchairs were invented, to make it easy to get Grandma off the cliff. There are so many ads. And in terms of Social Security reform, when I ran in '96, obviously not successful, which is why I'm here today, but in '96 in Sun City, I proposed to the seniors gathered there that we reform Social Security with the proviso their benefits are not going to be touched. Once you reassure people you're not going to take something away from those who think they have something, then they're willing to listen to something new for a younger generation. But that's the big mistake of Republicans, is we look like we want to take something away instead of figuring out, excite young people where they learn their work is providing their capital retirement. We'll get to that in the next panel. But the wheelchair makers probably don't want to have the cliff as one of their motifs. But with that, we'll go to Dr. Paul Winfree. He's the president CEO of the Economic Policy Innovation Center, EPIC, which we need right now. And he's going to sum up what he's heard and make some of his own observations. So, Dr. Paul, we probably learn more from you than sometimes from other doctors on TV, who shall go nameless. So enlighten us.
Just to be clear, I'm a fake doctor, not a real doctor. My father, has a PhD in physics, my entire childhood, I told him that he was a fake doctor, not a real doctor. And when I finally got my PhD, he said, how does it feel to also be a fake doctor? But he likes to remind me that, rather than practicing, we actually, are doing research. So, Chairman Hensarling, that was the most depressing thing I think I've ever heard. I almost don't know where to go from there. I mean, you essentially just ended with, we're about to go into a dark times, and unless some of the folks in this room step up and help pull ourselves out of them.
You got me on a good day.
Full disclosure, the good chairman is on EPIC's board, and he's right. We did get him on a good day. And we're also lucky to have him. So, the title of this panel is The Collapse of the Hamiltonian Norm, and I think we're supposed to confine our remarks to what happened over the last 16 years. And I don't think that Bill chose those dates arbitrarily. The period's bounded by the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. In the U.S., both events triggered a fiscal and monetary response. The global financial crisis triggered a fiscal response by the federal government equivalent to about 3% of GDP during the years of the crisis, and a persistently higher level of spending after the crisis of about 1% of GDP. It also led to several reforms to the way that monetary policy was conducted by the Federal Reserve, which may have given central bankers additional tools to attempt to manage adverse fiscal events. However, the additional discretion has increased risks associated with maintaining a significant balance sheet made up of private and public debt. These reforms have increased the need for larger fiscal stimulus packages to achieve the same desired impact. Changes in trade policy are also increasing the demand for higher fiscal stimulus during adverse economic events. When a nation has a relatively open trade policy, it's possible to remove pressure through exchange rate depreciation, which increases export competitiveness. Tighter trade restrictions have the effect of reducing that flexibility and putting more pressure on the direct fiscal response. The good news is that before 2020, we had low rates on historically safe assets or treasuries, and high potential economic growth afforded us with additional fiscal space or the capacity to take on debt without compromising access to debt markets. And then COVID-19 happened. Between the beginning of 2020 and the end of 2023, new bonds paid for 76% of all new spending. So let me just say that again. Since the beginning, the first quarter of 2020, all additional spending above baseline, 76%, has been paid for by bonds. Tax revenues have paid for about 7%, and money creation has paid for about 14%. The most recent crisis that we've had that relied so heavily on debt and money creation was the Civil War. And the way that we ended up paying for most of the debt following the Civil War was floating it overseas. I'll talk about this in a moment, but I don't know that that's an option here. To give you a comparison, during World War II, we paid for 46% of all new spending with debt and 10% with money creation. 30% came from taxes, from revenue, including the growth that occurred after the war. Since 2020, debt held by the public has increased by $9.1 trillion, and this year roughly $8.9 trillion in treasuries will mature, and the deficit's projected to be $1.5 trillion. That means that the Department of Treasury, this Treasury Secretary that you were talking about a moment ago, will need to go to debt markets for about $10 trillion in additional borrowing in the next 12 months to roll over existing debt and to pay for new debt during a period when the Federal Reserve is reducing the size of its balance sheet to combat inflation. That is a problem. Meanwhile, institutional and foreign investors have been buying fewer treasuries over the last several years. Normally, during times of crises, investors buy treasuries as the world's premier safe asset to hold on to value. But under this dynamic, the law of supply and demand would suggest that if more additional debt is issued, for whatever reason, the interest rate on treasuries will increase, thus reducing the nation's fiscal space. Even under current law, with no wars, recessions, pandemics, relatively good potential economic growth, and historic interest rates, the net interest on the debt will soon become so significant, and the rate at which it grows will become so difficult to keep pace with under economic growth that we will enter what is called a debt spiral. At that point, interest rates will increase, fiscal space will evaporate, and it will become necessary to reduce the deficit to achieve a primary surplus. In a paper that I published just this week, I estimate that under current law, this would begin to happen around 2035 under current policy or an environment where the federal government is doing what it is doing right now. It could happen by 2032. This is coincidentally around the same time that the Medicare, hospital insurance, and Social Security, old age, and survivors insurance trust funds will become exhausted. My estimate suggests that to delay this from happening over the next 20 years, we would need to see a primary deficit reduction, that is not including net interest payments, of about $2.1 trillion before 2035 without compromising economic growth, in addition to paying for any new spending or reduction in tax revenues not assumed in the Congressional Budget Office's current law baseline. So we have to ask ourselves, is the Hamiltonian norm dead? I don't know that it is entirely dead right now. It's just mostly dead. But I don't know.
The corpse is twisting.
The corpse is certainly twisting. But what is certainly the case is that we are left with fewer options today than we were 10 years ago. And it's very possible that without record economic growth, the federal government will have to entertain a fiscal consolidation plan in the near future. That's becoming increasingly difficult as long-term policymaking has eroded and as we've become accustomed to paying for things later that we can have today. In essence, we have a cultural problem. Also complicating this fact are the goals that economic policy have fractured. As late as the 1970s, most economic policy experts maintained that low unemployment and stable prices should be the governing objectives of economic policy. Imperfect as they may be, however, low unemployment and stable prices are objective qualities. We can and do measure both. You may or may not agree that the government can do anything to reduce unemployment or keep prices stable. However, we can determine whether or not unemployment is low and whether or not prices are stable. They're fairly transparent too. The voters have a good idea of whether or not those two things or conditions are met as well. One of the problems that we are experiencing today amongst policymakers is that there's nothing close to a consensus on what the governing conditions of economic policy are, nor is there a mechanism for achieving one because the economy is generally seen as being shaped by an inherently political environment. This creates a postmodern problem where ideology, science, and collective action are combined into one confusing pot of policy choices. The correct economic policy becomes whatever the governing consensus dictates, and the actions are limitless because the government can create all opportunities to fix all ills. This has, in recent years, been shaped into prescriptions that can help bring jobs back from China, reduce inequality, encourage private sector investment, provide free health care and schooling, solve 400 years of systemic racism, and solve climate change, among literally every other problem under the sun. It's the Hamiltonian norm, however, that has been holding back the floodgates. And if it's truly breaking down, then we are ultimately going to pay the price one way or another. Thanks so much.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions before we get to the audience with this distinguished panel. What exactly, and I'll start with you, former Congressman, could be cut from the budget? Where they always say, oh, you know, you're going to grandma on the cliff syndrome. What reel off some of the things that could be cut that would really make a difference? Then I'll ask the other panelists too.
Everything. Everything. Now, having said that, Steve, to solve our debt crisis, this is very important. You don't have to cut a penny. You don't have to cut a penny out of the budget. You have to cut the rate of growth. Again, you cannot have programs growing at 6 and 7% per annum and having GDP limp along at 1.5 or 2%. So that's a very important aspect of the debate. But it also speaks to the point, Steve, that I think that everything does indeed have to be on the table. And again, the grand bargain is if you can find profiles in courage, and there may be a finite number of them, it's going to take Republicans swallowing hard on tax increases. It's going to take Democrats swallowing hard on entitlement reform. But again, to say, where do you cut? You don't have to cut anywhere, but you do have to, again, tamp down that rate of growth. So I know the next panel, or I guess the panel thereafter, is going to talk about various and sundry different programs, but it's not something I'm troubled by. You ask me, give me a red pen, we'll start cutting it all out.
That point is very important, and that is you don't ostensibly have to cut spending. After World War II, the budget increased over time, yet the debt proportion GDP went from 121% down to 35%, just with a little bit of occasional spending restraint and some decent growth. So let me just quickly go to think about what you want to cut, but is there a federal budget process, any changes that would help the process, whether it's impoundment or something else? Much mention has been made in the early 20s, the creation of the Budget Bureau, which for the first time brought rationality instead of every department doing their own thing and sending to appropriate committee in Congress, where you could have somebody try to control what was happening. Any budget processes, changes that could help out?
I'm sorry, is that still for me?
You can start, and then we'll get to the others.
Well, I was about to say, Steve, I don't put quite as much thought into these matters as I once did. I allude earlier to the fact that in my career, I'd worked closely with Paul Ryan. And the first bill that I worked with on him was a budget process reform bill. It was 172 pages. It was a thing of policy wonk heaven. It was wonderful. The leader allowed us to put it on the floor. I think Paul and I set a record. We went to the floor with 138 co-sponsors and ended up with 82 votes. I think it may be a congressional record. What happened? What happened was all of our various process reforms, be it anything from zero-based budgeting, cost-benefit analysis, it all impinged upon the appropriator's ability to spend money. And so all of that went to the wayside. And it also taught me that, again, all of the action is going to have to be on the entitlement side. So I'm more focused now on what are the pro-growth policies that can take us to 3.5%, 4% GDP growth. And how do we work in galvanizing public opinion to do the policies that we need to ensure we have better health care outcomes and better retirement security for future generations? So again, I could go back and do the policy wonk thing, but this guy to my left, since I serve on his board, is far more qualified than I am to do that.
Just a couple observations. We have states that balance their budgets, so that's naturally a place to look. Some have constitutional requirements to do so. Some governors have line item vetoes. These are things that get talked about a lot at the federal level, but even as we worry about our federal budgets, it certainly makes sense to look at the states, and many of you know we refer to our states as laboratories of democracy at times. What are they doing, and what can we learn, and how do we implement it? The other point I wanted to make, I don't have any particular cuts to suggest, but I don't doubt the congressman's belief that there are many to be made. The other thing that really surprised me at the Labor Department was that we had close to no information about the efficacy of the programs that we were funding. My rough recollection is the Labor Department had a $15 billion budget. About $12 billion of that went to job training programs. There were almost no studies and very little information about how successful those programs were. That meant, among other things, that if you wanted to go to a job training program and you had 5 to pick among, you, as somebody in need of training, would have no way of knowing which one was doing a good job or not. And so I was just stunned that we were spending that amount of money without really metrics for gauging our performance. And the studies that did exist indicated that the programs were extremely ineffective. So I suspect that problem is prevalent, a lack of review and accountability for spending.
Paul?
Yeah, sure. I'm with Jeb. I would shut it all down. Give me the red pen and let's go to town. I think that ultimately, and just to follow up on your remarks, in order to do something meaningful to preserve fiscal space out into the long run, you have to do 2 things. The first thing you have to do is you have to make sure that you're maintaining potential economic growth. There's a huge difference between 2% potential economic growth, which is CBO's baseline projection, and 2.5 and 3%. And so if you can increase economic growth or at least do things not to penalize potential economic growth, that's a good thing. And as we know, there are lots of different policies, from trade to migration to the welfare state, that all can have some influence there. In terms of budget process in particular, I wrote a book that I'm sure that you all read. It was a New York Times bestseller called "A History and Future of the Budget Process in the United States," and it was published in November of 2019, which was a perfect time to publish a book and go on book tour right before the pandemic started. And in that, I trace the different trends in the process and what led to the different changes in the process and major budget reforms. And 2 things stood out. The first thing that stood out that should give us some optimism is that Americans are traditionally, culturally, a optimistic, get it things done people, right? I mean, when we hit challenges, when we hit roadblocks, we find ways to deal with those roadblocks. And so if we have a fiscal or a monetary event coming at some point in the future, I suspect that we will do what we need to do to make sure that that it turns out well. Because we've been here before, we have. We've defaulted on our debt before, several times actually, over history. I'm sure folks talked about before. I'm not encouraging it, but it has happened, and we've lived to see another day. One of the things that I talk about in the book that is one of my favorite stories is that just before the Civil War, the Congress implemented very high tariffs, and Lincoln is inaugurated in early March of 1861. And within his first 30 days, the government quite literally ran out of revenue. They did not bring in any money from tariff revenue for the rest of 1861 when we entered a civil war. And so essentially Chase and Lincoln had to go figure out how to change the process to get money so that one could fight a war.
We got a great lesson on that this morning.
Yeah.
The crisis of December of 1861.
Yeah.
So any questions from the audience? We have our senators and distinguished students ready to pass around the microphone. Please state your name, where you're from.
Hello, my name is Yehyun, and I'm from Athens, Georgia. I have a question for anyone. With the advancement of technology and artificial intelligence, some have speculated that most, if not all, labor in the next few decades will be automated, leading to mass structural unemployment, the end of the labor market, wealth inequality, and subsequently decreasing consumption spending and shrinking GDP. So with the lessons learned from 2008 and the COVID stimulus checks, what solutions, such as UBI, if at all, do you foresee implementing in response to this future?
I'll butt in before letting Eugene respond, but every advance in technology creates jobs, creates wealth, without exception. By the way, the first worry about automation goes back to the early 1800s. Back in the 1960s, the Kennedy administration was fretting about this. Most of the job descriptions that existed in the early 60s don't exist today, and we employ about 3 or 4 times as many people, and the real incomes are higher.
Yeah, Steve gave the labor secretary's answer too. It really is a marvel in a sense, but that's what I've observed is that technology, it does eliminate some jobs, but it creates new jobs. I saw just yesterday that tech jobs on the whole are declining right now, but jobs are going through the roof in one area, AI. So AI is, in that sense, creating jobs. And as labor secretary, I spent a fair amount of time visiting newly built manufacturing facilities. And these were high-tech facilities that were creating jobs around the high-tech. So it's not a worry of mine. And by the way, you got no choice anyway. It's coming.
John, you want to say add to that? By the way, on AI, just remember one of the great novels, Frankenstein, written 220 years ago, was based on fear of what electricity was going to do to humanity. They thought they could take inanimate objects and bring them to life in the laboratory. It didn't happen, but made for some great movies.
We'll get there eventually.
Thank you. I'm Nick Jacobson. I'm from Pennsylvania. I was a senator back in 2018. It seems like a lot of what a lot of you have talked about is that something went wrong in 2008 in the response to the recession, and that has stuck with us. So I'd be curious to hear, particularly with respect to the Federal Reserve, what should the Federal Reserve have done? How could it have restrained itself from using the authority that, well, it seems to have? And what was the cause of the recession that really needed to be addressed?
I'll jump in here. One, and I'm glad you got to the latter part of your question, and that is what was the cause? I think you could make a very, very cogent argument that it was bad public policy, that you had the federal government that incented, cajoled, mandated financial institutions to loan money to people to buy homes who could not afford to keep them. They did not help the families, they didn't help homeowners, they didn't help the country. Fannie and Freddie were solvent until one day they weren't. So one, you have to look at the underlying cause before you get to the so-called solution. And I got to tell you, in the time that I spent in public policy, 8 terms in the U.S. House, I can't tell you how many times I concluded that the cure was worse than the illness. Okay? What would have happened if we actually allowed market discipline to take place? What if we actually allowed a financial institution to fail? I mean, think in terms of some of these mass forest fires that you see, for example, in California, where at one time they did controlled burns and would allow a little bit of the forest to burn, but they kept on trying to protect it, and then one day they couldn't. So it's hard to prove a counterfactual. I don't believe in the narrative that had the Fed not intervened, that we were looking at the next Great Depression. I don't see the evidence that was true. I think somebody would still go out and buy these firms. I think that we could have used, there were improvements that could be made in bankruptcy code, but I do believe these firms could have been resolved through judicial means. And again, we have set a terrible, terrible precedent that has now conflated monetary and fiscal policy at the Federal Reserve. It caused them to now balloon their balance sheet, and now there are calls to have them bail out green industries and other unique sectors of the economy, which will make it even more difficult to prevent a future financial crisis.
Well, with that, good way to end. Sometimes less is more, as Coolidge would say. So with that, thank the panel, thank all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.